up in the Students' Union bar, as you do, and started talking. It was more like a social sort of thing. We just sort of found a community of people that was interested in making a change, making something interesting. We've done a project in the student performance piece in like the Students' Union bar, like using cutting up text and making a sound piece, and that was like the first sort of collective project that we worked on. Me and John finished college and came back to London, and then the rest of the group came back to like a year afterwards, and then we basically set up a film. It was like a film, what did we call it, film society first, like screening film and stuff like that.
So you're all very kind of interested in film anyway,
Yeah,
and how it all worked together?
Yeah, actually I wasn't very interested in film. No, I had other plans, but they dragged me into it. No, it's just the idea, like, what basically is very simple things, like doing the fine art work. It's like you're making things, but then you want to put it in service of something. And then the something was the rest of the collective, the rest of the group. There's the ideas, there's the desire, there's the positive. And so, we can, that's what I needed. That's what I needed to actually find that X factor, that other thing. And then by being with a group of people that introduced me to text, ideas, music, food, entertainment, fellowship, that made sense. It made perfect sense. And from that moment, I was committed. And it was the outcome. We started doing, like I said, the first project was like, it actually worked. I felt excited by the possibilities that something you can do this thing, and there was no restrictions. I was allowed to sort of be expressive in that area.
And this is around 82, 83, the first stuff you're doing.
Yeah.
So Gary, I'll come to you. I mean, you were not part of the collective, but, talk about seeing this, like to sit at home and watch this for the first time.
Perhaps some context it would be good, actually. I mean, I'm actually from Birmingham, born and bred in Birmingham, and indeed my first sort of like exposure to Black Audio Film Collective was almost like a pilgrimage, going down to London to see Signs of Empire, which was their tape slide production. And at that time I'd been working on sort of like tape slide productions for theatrical kind of like...
Can you just kind of explain what slide tape
collecting
is?
Oh gosh, yeah. I'm just assuming the sort of like context. Thank you, Ash. Do you remember the carousels with 80 slides? 35mm in the projectors? And quite radically, the kind of stuff that I was doing in theatre productions was using 2 dissolver units like this, all in real time. So it was a medium which afforded the ability to create really high quality, quite spectacular pieces of kind of like, work, if you sort of, for those who are familiar with it. And indeed the production that they did, Signs of Empire, was, there was this mythology around it, and I went down on this pilgrimage to see it and was just completely, it was remarkable.
We couldn't afford to make the film of it, so that's the cheapest. The cheapest version was to actually shoot on 35mm slide film and black and white slide film, and actually make the pieces, which is like photographing monuments around London, and lecture set in text on small sheets of translucent material, plastic, and then layering that inside a glass frame and making 80s carousel.
Yeah, and the reason why I mention it, and I'll speed up a bit, was basically because there was this kind of like radical, visceral kind of way that they treated the material, and also it kind of embodied, in a sense, that production, all the kind of sentiments of the place that I came from, Birmingham, which at that time was one of the preeminent places with Stuart Hall, the cultural theorist, had been at the Centre of Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham University. There were other theorists like Paul Willis and others. You know, there was this great degree of a sort of like interest around semiotics, and you know, for those, you know, sign and signify. And here was a piece of work which embodied all of that, if you see, which brought that to life. It wasn't just merely theory. Hence the kind of context for this. So that was my first introduction to black audio. Then, if we fast forward to the actual sort of like, you know, how I felt about seeing the film for the first time. Well, it was remarkable really, because my house was the main stretch that you saw in that film. It's called Soho Road, which is relatively short. It's only about 2 miles long. But my house was only half a mile away. When the riots was on and it was in, you know, full throat, I didn't even know. What happened was my wife's mother called us from 220 miles away from up in Yorkshire and said, "Are you okay?" And we said, "Yeah, we're fine. Why? What's happening?" "Oh, there's a riot going on." We opened up our bay windows and looked through there, and we could just see the glow above the Victorian terrace houses, which was remarkable. And okay, what do I think about the film? Well, in a sense, it sort of embodies a really, again, interesting way of kind of like synthesizing the ideas of being, at that time, a 24-year-old, and having these kind of like multiple, sort of almost like complex perspectives and ideas, not having just one consensual view. I mean, Ash made a kind of like in the introduction, this interesting point about, you know, the dominant sort of like media, sort of like voice, so to speak. And what I felt as a, you know, somebody who actually lived there and experienced it, was that the film embodied that sense of not just even, it wasn't like a sermon, if you see what I mean. It provided all these different fragments of different insights that you could then pull together as a viewer. And then, of course, the sound. Well, it's strange, kind of like, you know, we've been working together now for like 14 years, because so I was a fan of Trevor before I knew him, if you see what I mean, and indeed was, you know, seduced by this kind of like radical use of sound within the piece itself, not just within Handsworth Songs, but certainly seeing as we're talking about that as a film, and we're here. Both the kind of use of kind of like the kind of like the orchestral stuff, or the sort of like the drawn out sort of like.
Well, that was something I wanted to actually talk to you about, which was bringing together this incredible range of different sources, from making the voiceovers work. You talked specifically when I spoke to you for the monograph about using like whale song for that the chase scene with the cops at the start. So maybe you could just talk about your role in the group when you became designated sound designer, and the way that you worked within the group to make that happen.
I'm a humble servant of John Akomfrah. I just do what he says. He gives me space to sort of
sound designer.
He gives me space to do what I do, but in conversation with John, the editor, I get a line to follow, to work towards. So they're working on the imagery, working on the layers within that, and I fill in the sonic gaps. And so I'm sort of liberated on that sort of level. But the freedom to sort of come up with stuff, that bit I quite enjoy. And then seeing and hearing the sound being blended with the image, that's when it starts to really come alive again. Oh, you've done that? Yeah, it works. And then you go on to the next level, then you see it on the big screen and you think, shit, it worked. Yeah. It really, I like the sort of immediate gratification kind of thing. I don't like wasting time. I just want to get to it. So that, seeing the connection between the image and sound, because I also do the sound recording on location as well. So I get my first taste of when we're doing the interviews, I'm listening to the space that we're interviewing people in, so I'm capturing stuff from that and then taking that away and manipulating stuff and then offering that as sort of sound pieces as well. So I'm having that opportunity. But yeah, like I said, it's John is the key.
And you still work with John today, obviously. Yeah. And something I mentioned in my introduction was the extraordinary response that the film had when it came out, and you have public intellectuals arguing in the newspaper. Maybe, Gary, I'll come over to you for a second.
Yeah.
Why don't you talk about the reaction to the film at the time and what you remember about it and how significant that was?
Yeah, of course. I think what was important was that here was, it was the archival material as well, played a really kind of significant part of the kind of the way that the film was received. And that was because, in a sense, the kind of like contemporary experience, again, I was 24 and our peers, the way that we kind of felt in terms of our own sort of like, the way that we'd been kind of like subjected to ongoing kind of harassment from the sort of like authorities, and in particular the police who articulated that kind of like sentiment. Seeing the kind of archival material and seeing the kind of story and the narrative and the way they portrayed our kind of like the aspirations of our parents, in a sense, really, and the kind of struggles that they'd gone through, it provided this really interesting kind of like thread, if you see what I mean, and one that kind of made it more incredibly powerful. And it was at a point when, you know, Smoking Dogs have continued to do this, where the kind of your exposure and access to archival material was minimal or zero. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really was. Perhaps there might have been material in supporting programs on, you mentioned Channel 4, you know, or particular productions which didn't speak to our own kind of like sentiments and
it's official history.
The official history, absolutely. But to see that same material, but used in a way here, and again, you know, not to provide it as kind of like a supposedly sort of like cultural nationalist sort of, you know, this counter perspective, but rather something that suggested the ambiguous nature of you know, how your kind of your cultural identity is actually formed. And I think that's what made it so incredibly powerful. So it was a catalyst for that, you know. So it wasn't like, oh, this is an anti-Thatcher. Thatcher being the Prime Minister, the brutal and cruel Prime Minister who came into power in 1979 in Britain and then set out and embarked on a process of sort of like taking a machete to whole swathes of communities.
It was 79 to 91.
Yeah, I remember it very well.
So we don't have in the UK the two minimum terms of like.
No, you can just carry on.
You just go on as long as you like, which was great for everyone. But what I was going to quickly say, if you don't mind, just specifically what Rushdie didn't quite seem to get was, because you're talking about rioting and uprisings, his idea behind his criticism was that, oh, here we go again, more films about riots. But what he completely missed was that you're trying to create a new language and have open up space and have ideas clashing against each other.
And it was poetic as well.
Yeah. So before I open it up to the audience, I think I just wanted to ask you guys one more question. In 2011, not too long ago, very similar events as to the ones you see depicted in the film happened in Tottenham, when a young black guy was shot and killed by the police, and there was uprisings and unrest across the whole country, and it all happened again, and it felt a lot like history repeating. So could you guys talk just about how relevant and resonant the film feels today, and how much it speaks to current events?
Yeah, perhaps you could talk about that, because in 2011 the irony was I was in Park Slope in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay.
That's where I was living at the time.
This is one for you, Trevor.
I think we were constantly reliving the thing. Again, ghosts of other stories. We realise, or at some point you realise you've been through this before, you've heard this before, you've seen this before. And all that's happened is that the names may be changed, the locations may be changed, but the situation is relatively the same. And unfortunately, we are going through cycles, and every now and then we will repeat ourselves again. I was just going to say, what's interesting about the archive is that you got to see images that you hadn't seen before, or what we saw. We actually put them in service in a different way, not in the way that they was made. We made them not speak for us. That's the dynamic I think that's of interest, and that's the thing that I'm really definitely proud of that we was able to do. And these incidences that are constantly repeating, they're going to ask the same questions but not listen to the answers. They will ask the same questions but not listen, because they don't want to recognise that this thing is
Can I ask a question? So I was particularly. Oh yeah, here we go. I was particularly impressed with the kind of the pitch shifts in the kind of demonic lower sounds that happened in there. What inspired that? Did you literally slow down the tape recorder?
I like that they didn't want it. I'm a fan of they didn't want it. I'm a follower. No.
That's the headline for this Q&A. Does anyone in the audience have any questions or comments? Please don't be shy. Yeah.
So, thank you again for programming this. I have been kind of I could say a student of the collective, but I couldn't get access to stuff, so like a student in theory stuff, because it's been hard to see this work here. I really have been seeing this and some other recent films like Strong Island and The House on Cocoa Road. I've been really thinking about how so many films that resonate with me that come out of Black artists, you have to have the context of like generational experiences in order to tell the story. And I'm just been thinking about that a lot. Is that sort of an aesthetic within Black filmmaking, you think, in different parts of the world, or is it just a part of like people who have experienced diaspora? You can't tell a story in a way that's like fully resonant and thorough without investigating like the parents and the generations and the context, you know. And so I've just been really thinking about that. So I'm just curious, is that something that you all see as well? And is it just because of the experience of diaspora or being, you know, migrant or immigrants or what have you, or is it more, you think, something that's part of like the Black, like a Black aesthetic?
I think it's a tool that you can use from wherever you start from. You can draw from your own family experiences, or even use that as a starting point to actually create pieces of work. What's more familiar to you? What would be, what would be interesting to you to be just to investigate, or to use as a tool, or as many colours that you'd have to sort of play with. I think that's the part of it. Where we are, or the group of people that you're around, that feeds the multiplicity of ideas. That's what I think the collective gave me, is the space to, not to be singular. I was a part of a group of people that I didn't have to have all of the answers. I just had to be supportive of the aims and objectives of the group, and that benefit. And then we see, we share food, we share ideas, and that's what we learn.
I think it's a really interesting question, and it has come up in conversation with some of my peers. I think, in a way, what we see, I mean, I can't speak for all the kind of like manifestations of work that comes out from a particular generation in diaspora, but in a sense, I think what we see is the dynamic of what happens when a particular kind of like generation try to assert their own kind of like identity and personality, but at the same time they're synthesizing the kind of experiences of their parents, but also, you know, their own unique particular specificities of where they are and their own aesthetics, if you see what I mean. And this makes for a really, I think, really powerful kind of combination, because it's not like you're in denial of the kind of journey and the kind of context of how you got here, whatever, but you're also really, you know, this idea of asserting yourself, the fact that you've got a different kind of sense of how you hear things and how you see stuff, if you see what I mean, and creating, in a sense, a new language. And you can see that dynamic, and it's not always clean cut as well. It's really visceral, and I think audiences pick up on that, if you see what I mean. They can see that energy and the sort of like the blossoming, if you see what I mean.
But then storytelling, what kind of styles of storytelling that you work with, what kind of music that you like to listen to, or
You're getting there.
But But I do think it's a really interesting point you make, and from my perspective, I think when you look at a lot of immigrant stories, they come with a lot of emotional baggage that is not necessarily expressed in service of looking after or protecting the next generation.
But we all immigrants, though. I'll say, where are you from? I mean, you came from somewhere else. I would argue that unless you're a native American, somebody, or even then, you came from somewhere else. We all come from somewhere else, some other place. And that, we tell each other stories, we tell our stories to justify our existence in this space, and we're just constantly doing that. I think America is made up of immigrants. So somebody else's, you came from some other freaking place because that place was worse or less bad than the place we are now.
It's very true, but I think just in specific relation to two more of the films that are playing this weekend, Testament and Twilight City, they both specifically rest on the relationship between parents, between a parent that has come to a country and has had a child and then has gone back. And so there's a sense of not belonging, I think, and maybe that speaks to your question. I agree, we're all immigrants, everyone in America has come from somewhere else, but these are specific threads to the stories you're telling.
Even like, I'm saying now, you got the global, or it could be a regional, from the south to the north, there's that sort of thing. We all, one thing about humans, we constantly moving, and that's, in that movement we tell stories to make sense of where we are or where we've left.
I think we've got time for one more question before we move on to the performance. So, who's going to be brave enough? Go for it. Lady in the front. And we'll take yours as well, but go first.
I have a question about the South Asian. Speaking of diaspora, so the film also had a couple of different South Asian communities, like the Sikhs, and I think there were Muslim guys there too. But the film's not really telling their story so much.
It is. Well, I kind of know the guys in there, and worked with. So yeah, you're right. There was Bindi Khalsi, who was the main Sikh who was speaking from the Guru Nanak, and then there was Mokhtar, Muslim, Mokhtar Dar speaking. But in a sense, I think it does. I had to make it simple. So we had at the time the sort of like the authorities trying to fuel the divisions within Handsworth, if you see what I mean, between the Afro-Caribbean community, the Sikhs, the Muslims, and the Hindus, if you see what I mean. So it's an incredibly diverse bit of Birmingham, if you see what I mean. I think what you get in the film there is you get a really interesting insight into some of the sort of like preoccupations of those various communities, and particularly the Sikh guys who are really kind of like trying to ensure that people understand that there's a kind of historical precedence to this happening and the context of the kind of pressures that have led to this. I mean, the film can't, like any film, accomplish a kind of detailed insight into the complexities of those communities, but certainly as somebody who lived there and came from there, if you see what I mean, I think it does. Was your question that you didn't feel there was an adequate presentation of those different voices?
I was just wondering what their inclusion was about. Were they really sort of trying to affirm the story of the Afro-Caribbean?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. What isn't said in that film is that as a consequence of the riots, there was one of the a newsagent or post office was burnt, and a person of South Asian descent died, and so this again kind of like was picked up by the authorities, who used that as a kind of a continued wedge between the communities, and so I think in a way what we're seeing is in Handsworth Songs there is John Akomfrah is saying, I'm not going to address that in a kind of literal and didactic way, if you see what I mean, and have these counter voices, but rather to suggest, of course, I'm giving you more context, and I have a particular personal insight because I came from there, if you see what I mean, but that's that's why their inclusion is really, really important, if you see what I mean, because it's all these other voices, and indeed, that's really critical.
And we'll take one more before we wrap up.
Yeah, so if you guys remember me, I'm the record store
Yes, of
guy.
course.
I met you guys yesterday, and they were both pining over the same Lee Scratch Perry box set. So a quick audio question, just as I was thinking about Lee Scratch Perry and you guys and your love of music. The way taping manipulation and sourcing of audio and just doing sound, 30 years ago, compared to today, I can't even imagine, like, sound editing today, everyone does it on their laptop. And maybe just talk for a second on the analog approach to, especially with a film that jumps around as much as this one, the sound editing process.
We will use whatever's available and useful at the time. We're agnostic. We will do everything with whatever we've got access to. So analog is what we started with, and digital is what we work with now. So the blending of the two is not a major issue we'll work with, because each of them has its own sort of strengths and qualities, and that's where the magic and beauty comes from, is blending these things together and finding enjoyment in pushing the boundaries. And that's
Yes. Because it sounds like you did, if you said it, and I think that's what's extraordinary and brilliant. I think it's important for people to understand that. I know, but they don't know. You need to tell them.
You find the elements that you find some sort of empathy with, or you like, or like you do a sonic experiment. You test the idea out, and if you like that, you put it to one side and say, what happens if you put that with this? So it's a series of, like, Lego bricks, Lego, the little, it's that sort of, like, putting each little piece together to build a wall, not a wall. A bridge. Thank you, a bridge. Building a bridge, a arc, a rainbow, a doorway, a window, a portal, a seat, a chair, to rest upon, to consider ideas and to project. Yeah.
And I think on that note, it is time for the presentation of the Rainbow Door Window Chair. And the musical performance from these two wonderful gents. So please give them a big hand. Thank you for sticking around. Oh, sorry, 5-minute break and then the performance will start. I'm going to rush to the toilet.
I know they're recording the audio on this.
Yep. Good. Has two little pins going in it through some sort of high sensitivity box.
Well, it'll start dancing perhaps.
Yeah. Well, it's already going. They just have
Dancing
to turn on the volume so you can hear it. It's constant emanation.
Oh, so it's singing, it's not dancing.
Yeah.
It's
making sound.
I see.
You've heard this.
I missed that part of the Stevie Wonder album. Secret Life of Plants.
I think it was just like second grade for me.
Where the plants talk to you.
CO2 on the plants, and then they breathe the oxygen on you.
Yeah, you got it.
Second grade. I also misinterpreted yeast in second grade, though. Thought that my bread was actually like a living, feeling thing that I should eat, and I didn't eat bread for 2 years.
Well, it is a living organism.
It is. But I really thought about bread like a puppy. Like
But then did you learn at some point that like it all died as soon as it was cooked and became bread?
Just like animals.
It got complicated. Let's just say rice cake sandwiches, don't recommend them.
I love rice cakes personally, so I don't know about a sandwich.
That's all I ate for like 2 years.
Oh, that's dedication in second grade, man.
I was all about the bread rights.
Kids are sometimes remarkably.
It's underway.
Oh no.
In the beginning was the word. 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 Was the word. In the beginning was the word. Al principio era il verbo. In the beginning. Al principio era il verbo.
In the beginning was the word.
In the beginning was the word. In the beginning was the word.
Word.
Hapo mwanzo neno alikuwako.
In the beginning was the word. In the beginning was the word.
No comienzo era la palabra.
Was the word.
Mwanzo
Was the word.
neno alikuwako.
Was the word. In the beginning
Was the word. Was the word. C'était le mot. Era la palabra.
Au commencement.
The word. Era la palabra. In the beginning. In the beginning. In the beginning was the word. In the beginning was the word. No comienzo was the word.